Hello everyone, this is Alexey Borealis, a professional astrologer, and today we will talk about a technique in horary astrology known as the default option. Sometimes there are situations where the event is almost inevitable and only something truly extraordinary could prevent it. In such cases, standard predictive techniques do not work well. For example, the absence of the aspect, that is, contact between significators, usually indicates that the event will not occur. In about half of the cases, aspects do not form, and this also applies to the events that are clearly approaching. But if an event is just about to happen, denying it solely on the basis of missing a plane aspect leads to absurd conclusions. It would mean that half of all obvious events should suddenly be cancelled at the very last minute. But in reality, such constant miracles do not occur. So, if an event is inevitable, it almost always happens simply because it cannot be avoided. So, let me give you an example of the default option. Imagine that 5 minutes before a wedding, a nervous bride bursts into the astrologer's office and asks, "Will the wedding happen? What if something goes wrong?" And the astrologer casts a chart and sees there is no aspect between the bride's planets and the groom's. Does this mean the wedding is off? Of course not. Everything is ready. The guests are gathered. The groom is present, and there is no sign of cancellation. So the absence of aspects is quite a common phenomenon. A wedding being cancelled 5 minutes before it starts, that is extremely rare phenomenon. Therefore, in order to predict the cancellation of such an event, there must be something truly striking and unusual in the chart. For example, the refrenation. The groom's planet suddenly turns retrograde just before perfecting an aspect with the bride's planets. Or at the same time, the significators or significator of marriage conjuncts the south node, and simultaneously the bride's significator lands on the divorce star Vindimiatrix. So the simultaneous presence of several such strong negative indicators is just as rare as a sudden last-minute cancellation of the wedding. But if nothing like that is present in the chart, we assume the wedding will go ahead. That is the default option. It can be established either by context, as in this wedding example, or by the chart itself, when it clearly shows that the event is practically unavoidable. So let's have a look at a practical example. Here is a horary chart that was discussed in the students' group chat. Many students were unsure which technique to use precisely because the chart establishes a default option. The situation. The current is planning to apply for the government loan of 350,000 rubles to start a business. And he asks two questions. Will they grant the full amount? And will they grant anything at all? First, let's check the charts for radicality. If a process is not developing spontaneously, but under the influence of the planets, we can observe a correlation between the current circumstances and the planetary position in the horary chart. In this case, we say the process will continue to unfold under the influence of the celestial figure we observe. So we say that the chart is radical, from the Latin radix or root, meaning it serves as a valid or root base for forecasting the development of the situation. What is the quasitade of the subject of the question here? Government's money. This corresponds to the second house, money, from the 10th house, government, that is the 11th house of the chart. So we expect the chart to highlight this house as the main one. And it does. The Olga astrological program we use in our courses automatically analyzes radicality and highlights the 11th house, i.e. the loan, as the primary subject of the question. So we see a correlation between the circumstances and the chart. This confirms that the chart is radical and we can use it to make a prediction. The ruler of the 11th house is Jupiter. It represents the loan. Will the loan be large or small? The condition of the planet reveals the state of the object it signifies. Jupiter is in its detriment, meaning the loan will be significantly less than the requested 300,000 rubles. Not just a little less, but noticeably so, since Jupiter, i.e. the loan, is in the position of maximum debility. The 11th house itself shows the surrounding circumstances of the loan issuance. Usually, this is of less interest to us than whether the money will be given at all. But look at what's in the 11th house of the chart. The north lunar node is there. In my recent video on lunar nodes, I said that the nodes have little significance in the natal astrology, but play an important role in horary. When the moon, the universal significator of the flow of the events in a horary astrology, crosses the plane of the ecliptic, it intensifies the flow of events. And when it touches the south node, the flow of obstructive events increases, and when it touches the north node, the flow of favorable events is strengthened. Even though the moon is not yet on its north node in this chart, in its progressive movement, it will soon reach it. The north node will remain in the 11th house throughout this period. This means that in the near future we will witness a moment when the moon is both in the 11th house and on the north node, and this points to a moment, a future moment, when the flow of favorable events intensifies. So we expect the loan to be granted easily and without delay. The north node and south node also have another meanings. They can indicate an increase or decrease of the quantity or volume of the relevant object. Since we are talking about the 11th house, money, one possible interpretation of the north node is that the loan will be granted in full. However, we cannot draw this conclusion because it contradicts the debilitated state of Jupiter. We already know that only a small portion of the requested amount will be granted. Therefore, we cannot interpret the north node in this sense. So by the process of elimination, only one logical consistent interpretation remains for the presence of the north node in the 11th house. The entire flow of events will soon align in such a way that the loan will be granted easily and without delay. Now we can move on to the second question. Will the loan be granted at all? And the first instinct, of course, is to look at aspects, the context between the significator of the loan and the young man himself. Perhaps also consider the government's significator and examine receptions. Does it want to give the loan? Will it approve it? And so on. But we already know something important. Everything is aligning toward the loan being granted smoothly and without obstacles. So now let's ask, what if we started looking for the aspect and there wasn't one? Would that mean that the government wouldn't give the money at all, even though we already know that the flow of events points to the effortless outcome? Of course not. This is like the situation with the woman asking about the inevitably approaching wedding, where there are no aspects between her and her future husband, but the context itself says the default option. In our case, the future context, which is everything will go as smoothly as possible, is established by the north node in the 11th house. That is the default option set by the chart. Therefore, we must read everything else based on that premise. Instead of looking for signs that supports the granting of the loan, such as the government's approval or the aspects, i.e. the contacts with the money, we need to search for strong indicators that the already clearly approaching positive outcome might be cancelled. What could such indicators be? For example, Jupiter becomes stationary or combust while simultaneously conjoining the south node. But there are no such negative combination in the chart. So by default, everything will go as smoothly as possible according to the North Node in the 11th house. Thus, the answer to this horary question is very simple. The loan will be granted, but it will be very small. And that's exactly what happened. The loan was granted, but not the full 350,000, only 110. So this is it for today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next episode.